In this video, I'd like to try and discuss the touchy subject of expensive guitars. Are they worth the extra money or not? Over the course of my guitar playing journey, I've been fortunate enough to own and play several different models, some ranging from budget-friendly guitars all the way up to expensive vintage instruments. So I'd like to share my opinions on if some of these guitars are actually worth the extra money or not. Before I begin, I think it's important to actually define what a budget guitar and what an expensive guitar can be. And even as I try to define this, there's going to be subjective answers to this. But for the purpose of this recording and for the purpose of this video, I'm going to say that anything under £600, which is about $700 or $800, is going to be considered budget or entry level. I'm then going to say that anything between £600 to £1,500 is going to be considered intermediate, mid-range. That's about $800 to maybe $1,700–1,800. Then, in my opinion, it's kind of a grey area. Once you start thinking over £1,500, especially over £2,000, then in my opinion, those are definitely getting into the higher tier of guitar prices, at least in moderate terms. Obviously, we're just kind of dealing with what is affordable to most of us. So I'm kind of excluding, vintage pre-CBS Strats and 59 bursts. To answer this question properly, I'm actually going to be looking at 3 different types of guitars. We're going to be looking at solid body guitars, we're going to be looking at archtop jazz guitars, which is obviously what I deal with a lot, and then we're going to be looking at vintage guitars, and we're going to examine the price points in each of these categories. So let's start with solid body guitars. Okay, so when it comes to solid bodies, I mostly have experience with Strats and Tellys. I've only owned one Les Paul, so we're really going to be talking about Fender guitars to make some of these points. So in my opinion, Tellys and Strats are basically straightforward designs. They're bottleneck guitars, and as we've seen in recent years, there's been plenty of Chinese, Indonesian replicas of Fender guitars which have been really excellent guitars to play as well. So it's an interesting time when it comes to what guitars are available now, even compared to when I began playing. Like when I first began, one of my first electric guitars was an Encore Strat copy, and it was a terrible guitar. It played and sounded awful, and I've heard even worse stories by musicians that are older than me that grew up in the 70s and 60s. Apparently those guitars were even worse. So in one sense, we're very fortunate that we can get a very good playing and sounding guitar for much less than what we used to be able to. When I first began playing the guitar, an older musician, a fantastic blues guitar player, used to own lots of older Strats and Tellys, but in his later years he really just switched to playing modern Mexican Fenders, and he really said they sounded just as good. So in my opinion, and as some of you guys may know, at one point last year I actually used to own an American vintage Telecaster, a Japanese reissue 62 reissue Telecaster, and a road-worn Mexican Telecaster, and I was fortunate enough to have all of those at the same time for a brief period. But you'll also know that I'm not a massive fan of having duplicates of guitars. If you're going to have a collection, then I don't really like having too many of the same type of models. So having 3 Telecasters, I had to decide on which one I liked the most, and between the Mexican Road One, the Japanese reissue, and the vintage American, the 70s American vintage Tele, they were all good guitars, to be fair. And maybe if I had more space and more money, I'd have kept all of them a little bit longer. But when I compared those, the guitar that I actually ended up liking and playing the most was my Mexican Road One Telecaster, which in monetary value was actually the least valuable out of all 3 of those guitars. So coming back to this question, are expensive guitars worth it? I mean, it really depends on if you get a good guitar, right? I mean, fundamentally, if I could have probably had a bad Mexican guitar, I could have had an amazing Japanese Telecaster, and maybe a so-so American one. I'd have kept the Japanese one. So it really just depends. If you've got a nice guitar and you paid a little bit more money for it, then who cares? That's one answer to the question. If you get a guitar that costs you £200, a solid body guitar, and it plays great, then who cares too? If it plays and sounds good, then that's all that matters. Interestingly, with Fender guitars, I've actually played several different types of this same model. One particular memory was 52 reissue Telecasters, which have now been discontinued quite a long time ago, and I was surprised at how much each guitar varied model by model in the same guitar shop. So it's kind of interesting how they can vary as well. For me personally, the bottom line when it comes to solid body Fender type guitars is that you're fundamentally dealing with a fairly simple type of guitar. So my own opinion is that I don't really want to invest several thousands of pounds or dollars into a solid body guitar. I want a solid body guitar to be, just kind of the no frills thing that I can put some good pickups in. And so much of the sound from a solid body guitar comes from the pickup, right? There's been another video which some of you might have seen on YouTube where they basically just get a plank of wood, put a good pickup on it and some strings, and it sounds pretty good. So for me, the difference when you start to pay more money for some of the top end guitars really becomes smaller in the case of solid body Fender style guitars. The next type of guitars that I'd like to talk about are arch tops or jazz guitars. That's what you can see behind me there. You can see to my right I've got a Guild X170, and to my left there is my Gibson ES125. So what do I think of the different price points within arch top guitars? So if we start at the lower tier of arch top guitars, you can get some really nice models. Some models that I really like are Samick archtop guitars, and I recently tried an Aria archtop guitar as well, which was a really nice instrument. It played and sounded really, really good, and that guitar really was far less than $1,000, £1,000, and for me it really kind of did the job. It was a great guitar to play. And so you're talking there, in my definition of budget, it's certainly fitting within a budget jazz guitar criteria. If we now start to look at our intermediate tier of jazz guitars, and I define that at the beginning of the video as between £600 and £1,500, then in my opinion the best type of jazz guitars that you can get for that kind of money are Eastmans. Those are the ones that are readily available, and to me what you're basically paying for on something like an Eastman that you might not get on some of the guitars which I just mentioned are a couple of things. The first is the finish. The Eastman guitars have lovely thin finishes that really let the instrument breathe. They don't have those thick poly finishes that you might find on some of the lower end guitars. Some Eastmans are very resonant as well because of that. So they are fine quality guitars in my opinion, and some of them have Ken Armstrong design pickups as well, so they sound really good. In that same price range, you can also get several Japanese archtop guitars, which, as you know, if you watch this channel, I really like those type of guitars. So some of the older Yamaha jazz guitars, like the one I've got, are probably within that price point just about. And you also have other models as well, like the Aria Pro 2 Herbelis, which is an older kind of Japanese 175 guitar, and even the Japanese Ibanez models, which I had one of those in last year, which was a 2355, I think. That was a really nice quality guitar, and you find that the attention to detail to some of those guitars is sometimes a little bit higher than some of the budget guitars that I mentioned, but that doesn't mean that the budget guitars don't also play and sound great. It really just is attention to detail and feel of the guitar that might, in your mind, justify the extra price. In that same price bracket, you might also find some American-made jazz guitars like the Guild X170 I have behind me. You might just about find that in that price bracket if you're lucky and you search a while. They do tend to kind of push towards the more higher of the price tiers, generally speaking, but you might be lucky and find something like a Guild there. And obviously I really like that guitar as well. That's a very, very well made instrument, plays and sounds fantastic. The pickups are great, the pots are really good as well. It's just a very different guitar from an Eastman in quite a lot of ways, and it really comes down to the preference of the type of guitar you want, because generally speaking, what you could get in the intermediate tier range is you could, for example, get a carved top Eastman jazz guitar, which has a really thin top, and those are often in American jazz guitar companies. the highest of the archtop models, right? You know, you can get a laminate top guitar, which is generally more affordable because it's a lot easier to make quicker. And then the carved tops are kind of like the higher end Gibson guitars, you know, like an L5, like a Guild Artist Award, like I think maybe a Gibson Super 400 as well. So the top end guitars. So you could actually get an Eastman guitar in the intermediate price range where, as far as I know, there's no American jazz guitars that you could get in the intermediate price range. So that really then comes down to what's preferable to you. You could either have what I've got, which is like a laminate top Guild X170, or you might want a solid top Eastman guitar, which they're both really nice guitars. And at one point, as you might have seen, I used to own both a solid top Eastman and the laminate Guild X170. So it just comes down to your own preference there. As you're probably starting to see, it's a very hard and subjective question to answer, but I'd like to throw in one last story just to confuse you even more. So one of the most popular videos that I've done on this channel is when I took my Gibson ES125 that you can see right there, and I basically compared that to the Gurdin Fifth Avenue guitar. And I'll link that video if you haven't seen it already, because what you're basically dealing with there is a Gibson ES125, which is a vintage instrument. So you're talking really in the higher tier of the three prices which I mentioned in the beginning of this video, and you're talking about a Gurdin Fifth Avenue. That's the guitar which I compared it to, which is really in the lower, maybe intermediate at a push price range as well. I sold that Gurdin Fifth Avenue for £400, which is about $500, right? Now, if you watch that video, many people said on the comments that the Gurdin and the Gibson sounded identical and there wasn't much in between them. But I can tell you now, and even then there's a student of mine that tried both of these guitars, the Gibson was a much nicer instrument in every single way compared to the Gurdin. The pickup sounded a lot better. Obviously it's an older guitar, so the wood's nice and played in. The setup of the guitar was much nicer and the feel of the guitar was great as well. So even though on the video there might have not been that much in between a budget guitar and an expensive guitar, in reality, in my opinion, they were worlds apart. The last category of guitars that I'd like to discuss with you are vintage guitars. Now, the first thing that I've got to say about vintage guitars is that they all don't need to be expensive. As soon as you say the word vintage guitar, everyone starts thinking of 59 bursts, pre-CBS sunburst strats, 52 Blackguard tellies. Not always the case, especially at the time of recording this. I guess you could consider some instruments that were made in the 80s or 70s vintage at this point, right? So that kind of opens up the doors as to what vintage could be. But even in the golden years, as they're so often called, the vintage guitars, besides the big name stuff, Fender and Gibson, there are several other models like guitars by Harmony, Ibanez, Yamaha, etc. that are all vintage guitars too. And if you've ever tried those, they definitely have the feel of an old guitar. So you don't necessarily have to associate expensive guitars. All vintage guitars are not always expensive, right? Some of those, well, they're not budget. You might find some of those in the intermediate price tier. When it comes to vintage guitars, I've had a fair amount of experience playing these. My first vintage guitar that I purchased was when I was 17. I got an Oscar Schmidt Parley guitar, which I had for a couple of years. I wish I still had it, but I had to sell it to pay for the Gibson ES125, which you see behind me. I've owned a couple of vintage guitars since then, and I actually used to work as a demo guitar player for a company called Just Great Guitars. So every couple of months I get to go and play several vintage guitars and record them, play them for a few amps, and obviously that gave me some good insight as to what I liked and what I didn't like about these, especially when you compare them to the cost and the price tag on some of the big name models. Vintage guitars are probably the hardest category of the three to answer this question for. Most vintage guitars which have big names on are expensive, especially if you're talking about the golden year stuff. If they're worth it or not is completely up to you. They are what they are. You're not going to find them cheap, but a lot of people think that they are incomparable to new instruments, and you can get a good vintage guitar, you can get a bad vintage guitar. But if you get a really good vintage guitar and you get a really good modern guitar, both are absolutely great, and you could get a budget guitar that would completely cover your needs, and when you start to record them and throw them in a mix and things like that, the differences really start to feel much smaller, in my opinion. But there's so much more to it than just sound, really. Sometimes it comes to what ultimately inspires you, what feels good, all the nostalgic kind of qualities to it, things like that. But if we just focus on sound for 2 seconds, if anybody's ever played an older Fender or Gibson, then the fact is they do sound different, in my opinion. If you've played an older Gibson or an older Fender, the treble is different from the kind of treble that you would get on a modern guitar. And that could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing. But it is just different. So in my opinion, some vintage guitars are worth the price, because the price is what it is. It's not cheap, but equally there's kind of nothing like them, and the relics and things like that, while they're amazing instruments, and I've got relics, they're just not quite the same as a good vintage guitar. Even though the components of the guitar are definitely not really worth the price tag, it just is where it is. And it's one of those things where you think, okay, some models are still accessible within reach. If you want to afford a good vintage guitar, you can trade up a few other guitars to try and get near them. And it is where it is. You either kind of just walk away from it and you think, okay, these are too expensive, I don't want to get into them, or you like it and you do want to try one. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Do you think that vintage guitars are really worth the price tag or not? The last point to consider is actually playing gigs with these expensive guitars. So for most jazz musicians, gigs tend to be quite low paid, really. So what I sometimes like to think is, are you really going to take a £5 guitar to a £50 gig? You know, is it really worth kind of taking it out and risk kind of getting it knocked over, getting it dinged? Obviously, we're going to be much less precious about a guitar if it's only a few £100s. And another good point is the more inexpensive guitars, especially when it's not something that's vintage or custom made, tend to be very easily replaceable. And some modern brands are very, very consistent, unlike some of the other brands that I mentioned in this video. So the worst case could happen if your guitar gets stolen or something like that, then knowing that you can buy another one which is going to be pretty much the same guitar is also, you know, good to consider. Whereas if you've got like a rare kind of vintage guitar and that's gone, then you could be looking for years to find a replica of that. Of course, the flip side to that is if you've got an expensive guitar, then you could basically consider that a recording guitar or a home guitar, something that you don't take out as well. So that's another thought to stew upon. Those are my ramblings on expensive guitars. I'd love to know what you guys think. Please share your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you like this video, please subscribe to this channel.